Good day, it's Tuesday, August the 17th. I'm Martin Gagel with Market Radius Research. Today we have CEO Christopher Ecclestone of Battery Elements on the call with us today. This is neither a recommendation nor investment advice. We're here to learn about the company. Please do your own due diligence and come to your own investment conclusions. Chris, thanks for joining us today, and let's hear your story.
Thank you, Martin. My disclaimers are that Battery Elements is a private company at the moment, so you can't invest in it as a member of the public. I'm just here mainly today to tell people about the other battery elements that you rarely hear about, and how we intend to pursue some of these opportunities. As you can see here, there are more battery elements out there than just the nickel and cobalt that you hear about, or if you wanted to expand that to the manganese and nickel that are also mentioned. There are elements that are less well known, but they have a key role in various battery formulations. And the prime one that we're pursuing at the moment is antimony, but we're also interested in tin and fluorspar. So firstly, before I get on to antimony, I might mention tin. Tin is, pretty common, people think, but tin is actually used in lots of applications. And one of the most interesting ones that's up and coming is the use of tin as an insulator in lithium-ion batteries to try and stop the problem that they've had in the past of spontaneously combusting. So the tin actually insulates the anode and the cathode from getting overheated and then catching fire, which has been one of the fears about lithium-ion batteries for the last few years, and has created scares at various times. And so tin is the solution to that. But tin is a much bigger metal that's used. The largest application is in solders and in plating and in alloys. The other element that interests us also is fluorspar. Now, fluorspar is used in an enormous number of chemical applications, but in the case of batteries, and particularly lithium-ion batteries, it's the component currently in lithium-ion batteries that no one talks about, because it is the electrolyte as lithium hexafluoride phosphate that actually transmits the electricity between the anode and the cathode, and so it makes plays a vital role in lithium-ion batteries, because the anode and the cathode would not interact, and there would be no point in a lithium-ion battery without the fluorspar component. But many people have not been looking at this. Fluorspar is actually dominated first by China, then Mexico has a position in its production, and finally South Africa. But beyond those three countries, there's very small participation by other countries in the production of fluorspar. So it is essentially dominated by China. And, in recent times, the issue has been Chinese domination of strategic metals. And if we can go forward a few slides here. Martin?
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
So there are disclaimers there. Then I mentioned these battery metals there. If we go to the next page, here you can see the various, back one. Here you can see the various rankings by major government organizations that have created in recent years critical or strategic metals lists. And those lists generally go out to like 35 elements. Some of them are sort of pretty common, like copper, but others of them are very rare and are particularly dominated by China. And in the case of these three elements that we're going to be pursuing, China is the largest user and the largest producer of these elements. In the case of antimony, in particular, antimony has been dominated by China for the longest time. In fact, since before the First World War. So you imagine China dominance in many metals being a phenomenon in the last 20 or 30 years. In the case of antimony, its largest mine in China was found in the 1500s and has been solidly producing since around 1850. And sometimes has amounted to 30 to 40% of global production of antimony. And total global consumption of antimony every year is around 170,000 tons. And so that mine, which is called Twinkling Star, has been a true giant, an 800-pound gorilla of antimony mines. But like all things, all good things, it must come to an end. And so production has been falling at this mine over the last decade and a half. And that has made China more dependent, surprisingly, upon outside sources, outside its own mines. Because China had a big crackdown around 2012, where it closed down a lot of backyard antimony roasters and unsafe and environmentally polluting antimony mines in China. And that created a big spike in the price. So antimony for many decades has been sort of puttering around at 2,500 to 3,000 a ton. And then in 1 year, 2012, it spiked to around 14,000 a ton. And then it retreated back to around 9,000 after there was some replacement by users. They found other products that they could use, but there was a limit to how much you could replace the antimony in the mixes, because antimony's major use then and now is as a fire retardant. And if you basically reduce the quotient of antimony in fire retardants, they're not fire retardants anymore, and the product that you're applying them to, whether it's textiles or construction materials, plastics inside cars, those type of products then become vulnerable to catching fire, and the antimony is just a waste of time if you reduce the percentage too much. So over a space of like 2 years, early in the decade, they reduced the component of antimony, and the price of the metal stabilized around 9,000. Now, in the crisis of early last year, when most commodities got battered with the start of the pandemic, the price of antimony dropped to 5,500. Lo and behold, though, that was not really a viable economic price, and a number of factors came into play, and they produced an enormous uplift in the antimony price. So if we go to the next slide, you will see in the first slide there, which is the antimony price rose by 109% in the space of a few months, from the late last year until early this year. In fact, since then, it's risen even higher, and it has broached 12,000. Can we go to the next chart? Broached 12,000 a ton, and that is, in fact, the highest price that it's been. Can we go to the next slide?
The next one is the board members.
Yeah, since the spike of 2012. So antimony is now pretty much in demand. The prices, there's a premium for antimony in Rotterdam, which is basically the port of entry for European consumers. And in the US, there's a mad scramble on for antimony supplies. So a number of factors have led to this. One of them was the disruption caused by the pandemic. But moreover, then there was the coup in Burma. Burma is the second largest producer of antimony, and most of it is smuggled across the border into China, where it's passed off as Chinese product. But in fact, the disruption caused by that coup, which happened late last year, it caused supplies to drop totally from that market. The Chinese also, there's also a secular, as I mentioned, a reduction in Chinese production of antimony, because the Chinese just can't produce the same amount from these old mines as they used to. And the Chinese have become increasingly dependent upon buying product from artisanal miners, whether they're in Burma, Laos, Honduras, or Bolivia, and countries like that, where mom and pop operations basically dig holes and come up with quite rich antimony seams, but they just sell it by the sack, and then it's shipped off to China, where China passes it off as its own product. So what we decided to do was to focus upon the potential of antimony as a, not just its traditional uses, but its exciting new use, which is in a format called antimony molten salt batteries. Now, these are not for use in EVs or laptops or or cell phones. These are mass storage devices where you basically have a very large battery that is static. It's located somewhere near, say, a solar farm or a wind farm, and the product that comes out of those two types of formats of green energy is not controllable. You get sun during the day, obviously, but you don't necessarily get it all day long. And in the case of wind farms, you get varying degrees of wind through the day, night, whenever. So just channeling that power into the grid is not particularly a profitable exercise. The value comes from actually storing the power when it's not needed and then selling it back to the grid or to users when it is needed, which may not necessarily be when the sun's shining and the wind is blowing. So post-World War II, scientists discovered that molten salt antimony batteries, which was a format where you created antimony salts, and you, via applying heat, they became a liquid. You could actually store within this liquid the electricity. And so they were a format that was interesting, but nothing really happened about it until the last decade, when a company around 10 years ago was created by a professor from MIT in Boston, Professor Donald Sadoway, and he decided to look for commercial applications and ways of scaling up this rather academic theory of storage into a new format that could be marketed and sold on for practical applications. When he presented this proposal, the two parties who got behind him were Bill Gates, who's well known as the founder of Microsoft, and Vinod Khosla, who is well known as the founder of Sun Microsystems. They both thought that this sounded like the way forward. Up until then, mass storage devices for electricity have primarily been a format called vanadium redox flow batteries. They're a great format. They're not as durable in various extreme climate conditions as molten salt batteries are, but they're a great format. The problem is, though, that the price of vanadium has been a wild ride indeed over the last 10 years. And most vanadium redox flow battery manufacturers sustain that above $10 a pound, vanadium is not viable as a format. And we've seen 3 spikes where at times the price of vanadium has gone as high as $30 a pound, which has really sort of killed dead the prospects of vanadium redox manufacturers during that period. So while the price of antimony does fluctuate, it's got a different dynamic that means that it is better as a long-term prospect than vanadium redox flow batteries. If we can skip this, the board members of the company, and just go to the technology sections. Yeah, we can skip that. Skip the technical team. Okay, so why antimony? If we can go back one, please.
Yeah, okay.
Here, antimony has other uses. Ironically, is one of the first battery metals in that when lead-acid batteries were invented back in the 19th century and started being used for automobiles, the nascent technology, they needed an alloy that they could combine with the lead to harden the lead, because as anyone who's ever encountered lead knows, it's very bendable, it's very soft. But when you apply antimony to it, it hardens up and becomes more useful in lead-acid batteries. And lead-acid batteries are still a major usage of antimony at the moment, but because lead-acid batteries have a near-perfect recycling rate, the antimony that's in those lead-acid batteries is recycled. So it doesn't really affect that much the mine production. Most of the mine production goes into these fire retardants that I've mentioned, which are virtually unrecyclable. So antimony has a large usage, but doesn't have a large flow back of recycled product. Now, antimony is also its usage going back to the 19th century as well, when it was discovered that bullets, which back in those days were made out of lead and still are in many shotgun formats, antimony was great for hardening up lead in bullets, in ammunition, and in various other military applications. So if you look at a chart of antimony over the last 150 years, you'll see spikes, both spikes in price and spikes in demand. And the strongest spikes are in the First World War, the Second World War, and then the Korean War. And it was only really in the 1960s, 1970s that the new application of fire retardants was invented, that antimony started to have a different application than just the military. Because up until then it had been either the military or the lead acid batteries. And so it started to mix up the demand. Hopefully we're now on the cusp of a new phase, which is going to be the phase at which we see antimony going into new battery formats, and that is the molten salt battery formats that I talked about before. So if we could go on to the next slide, I think. Okay, so as we know, there's been a panic about critical and strategic metals, and justifiably so, because when one goes and looks at them, basically their usage is dominated now by, or their production is dominated by China, and in some cases their usages as well. The usage is not that important, but it's the end production of the product. So if a strategic metal is going into a strategic product, and you can only get that metal and that product from China, then China has you really in its grip. And that has been a big concern, particularly in the US, but now increasingly in Japan, the EU, Britain, and other economies, that that they may be entirely dependent upon the Chinese for these critical metals. And if these critical metals start to get in a shortage situation, and we can see that already in cobalt, for instance, and in antimony, tin, then the fear is that the Chinese will basically demand, and quite rightly so, that the product is used by domestic users, by domestic industries, and that the West can basically go whistle if it wants a supply of these metals, and will only get really what the Chinese don't want or don't need. And so that has created this issue that supply chains are now increasingly vulnerable to disruption via the pandemic, which was an external force, or via political machinations. And we saw this 10 years ago when the Japanese ran into trouble with the Chinese over some islands off the coast of China, and China said no rare earths for you, and that created a bit of chaos, because the Japanese were the second largest users of rare earths after the Chinese. So that was a wake-up call for everyone there. But despite the fact that it was a wake-up call, very few people did anything about it. The US had run down its stockpiles of critical metals that had built up during the Korean War and then the Vietnam War, and said, we don't need these anymore, we could get whatever product we want. And suddenly it started to realize that, maybe it couldn't get whatever product it wanted. And certainly it couldn't get the product it wanted when there was a period of international tensions, particularly international tensions with China, as we've been seeing in recent times in the South China Sea. Our goal at Battery Elements may be a substantial goal, but we hope to be producing around, over the next decade, around 10% of global production, or around 6 to 7% of global antimony demand and production, which would amount to around 10,000 tons per annum of antimony. Now, antimony mines don't grow on trees. China, as I said, dominates the space, and then outside China, it's mainly artisanal. In fact, there are only less than a handful of antimony mines outside China in the West. One of them is the Costerfield gold mine of Mandalay Resources, which is quoted on the TSXV, but which operates out of a mine in Victoria, in Australia. And there is also a small other mine in Australia called Red River Resources with its Hillgrove mine, which is just starting to get back into production in antimony. But otherwise, there's virtually no production outside China by a standalone antimony mine. And so our goal is to bring primary antimony mines back into action. And we know of where the mines were and still are. And so our first target is a mine called West Gore, which was Canada's largest producer and produced up until the First World War. It's in Nova Scotia, and we believe it still has substantial resources there. And so we hope to process initially dumps, tailings, and overburden that was left there at the mine, and which had a resource, a non-43-101 compliant resource calculated upon it many decades ago. Those tailings are still there, and so our goal is to actually reactivate the processing of those and use that as a funding source to then go underground at West Gore and hunt for the veins which were so prolific between the late 1880s and 1917, which was the heyday of the West Gore mine in Nova Scotia. What we also hope to do is to produce several thousand tonnes from that mine per annum, and then move on to maybe in the format of several other mines, geographically diversified around the world, produce small amounts of antimony, which basically add up to around 10,000 tonnes per year. That's our longer term goal. But if we get to that goal and the price stays the same, we're talking about sales of more than $100 million a year. And our goal then is to ensure that the operating costs are low enough that we do not, that we produce a good margin and then potentially can pay a dividend out of profits on the mines. But by doing so, we'd actually, even if we were producing just a few thousand tonnes per annum, we would end up being the largest producer outside China, because that might actually tempt the Chinese to make some sort of move upon us, because Canada was actually a producer of antimony up until last year at the Beaverbrook mine in Newfoundland, which was owned by the Chinese, and the Chinese shut it down for reasons unknown, just as the price was about to take off. And that is one of the other reasons that juiced up the antimony price from late 2020. If we can go on to the next slide, maybe. Okay, here we've got the usages of antimony. As you can see, they're in pigments, fire retardants, glass colorings, lead acid batteries, ammunition, those sort of things that I mentioned before. If we can go to the next slide.
Christopher, just to, so I'm just trying to, the annual demand for antimony is what,
170,000 tons.
170,000 tons.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. And very little of that actually comes from recycling. It's all primary mining, because, well, you know, once it's mixed into plastics as a fire retardant or into textiles, it's essentially unrecyclable out of those formats. Okay. Here we see the market for mass battery storage, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that while you can have a panel on your roof, a solar panel, much of the mass energy production from these new green formats, whether they be offshore wind farms or isolated wind farms or solar panels out in the desert, they're not in suburbia. They're at great distances away from the main usage points. And so the idea of the mass battery storage is to take the power when it's not used, when it's not wanted, and store it so that it can either be used for specific purposes. A good example might be, say, a mine site in Africa. You may have no access to a grid. Or there are other places where you can have no access to a grid in Nunavut or the Yukon, But, you know, you've got a mine there, you're relying upon diesel primarily, but you've also got other sources of power, green power, that you can store then into these units and reduces your diesel consumption. So, you know, in some cases you've got to use diesel because you're isolated from the grid. But if you do have other options in terms of solar or wind, then you can be also using those, but you need somewhere to store it when it's produced, because you're not using the electricity exactly as it's coming out of the panels or out of the wind turbines at that exact point. So there's soaring demand for mass energy storage as a way of smoothing the consumption of what is essentially irregular power sources, because, you know, a gas turbine power station can operate all the time. The same thing with a hydroelectric station. But the drawback of many of these new green formats is they only operate part-time. And so you need to store it when the going's good.
Is there a rough formula? You on this chart here, you've got power capacity in gigawatts. Let's say, and with the mass storage, let's say per gigawatt of storage using the salt battery, how much antimony would be required for that?
Well, that's a good question. So this company that was set up by Sataway and backed by these you know, potentates from the Silicon Valley is called Ambri. And Ambri have made a prediction that for each gigawatt hour of storage that is required, what would be needed would be 1% of current global demand for antimony, or production of antimony. So that would be around 1,700 tons of antimony. And 1,700 tons of antimony at 12,000 ton is a lot of antimony. But moreover, to add, and if you look at this soaring demand here for mass storage devices, not 1%, but to add 10%, you would be looking at essentially a 10% growth, and per annum in the demand for antimony and for molten salt batteries. And that demand is not being met at the moment. It can't be met unless there are new mines. And our goal is to try and fill that gap there. But, you know, growth in antimony over recent decades has not been, it's been steady at 1 to 2% per annum, but it's certainly not been of the order of 5 to 10%. And so we're maybe on the cusp here. If there is mass adoption of molten salt formats, not even mass adoption, just small adoption, you know, several gigawatt hours a year of new capacity being added, that is going to put severe pressure on antimony supplies. And the only way that prices can be kept down in that scenario is if there are new producers, and hopefully we intend to be one of those new producers. But that's a great question. So this rough formula of like 1% of global production of antimony would go to produce 1 gigawatt hour mass storage.
I could see that situation as possibly being a bit of a chicken and the egg situation, where people are maybe afraid to build up their molten salt battery like supply chain until there is a reliable source of antimony. But maybe people aren't going to develop an antimony mine. Like maybe they'll sign up with long-term supply agreements, say, okay, you do this and then we'll build that up. Yeah. Is there any sort of thought to how that sort of, because you got to invest in the salt
very interesting
battery production with the salt, with the antimony mine production?
Because we talk to the roasters, the end users, the traders. We talk to Ambri, and we talk to other potential producers of antimony. And I can say that they're all working together at the moment because they want to put the chicken back with the egg and make sure that if they're going to develop this new technology, that they've got the supply. Because Ambri will ultimately fail if it can't get enough antimony, or it can't get enough antimony at the right price, because it could then fall into the dilemma that vanadium redox battery operators have, that they quickly get priced out if the price spikes. So antimony's sweet spot is probably between 10 to 15,000 a ton, and those levels you can compete, and you can provide a product, and the miner will make money, the battery maker will make money, and the storage cost per gigawatt hour will be viable. If the price goes up too high, then you end up killing the goose that laid the golden egg. And so everyone's working at the moment towards the goal of producing a stable antimony market at a higher level than it was, over recent years, where really at prices of 9,000, or particularly when the Chinese engaged in predatory pricing from the 1980s until really around 2010, the price was 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 per ton. Everybody else in the world was driven out of the market, and the Chinese themselves weren't really making money out of antimony because they underpriced the product. So we can't go from a scenario of being an underpriced product to being an excessively priced product. And so for us, the best scenario is having the price of between 10 and 15,000 tons dollars per ton, because that would be brilliant. Frankly, we'd make a lot of money and we'd be very happy. We'd be laughing all the way to the bank.
I would see maybe the mines being structured and with like long-term offtake agreements, so that because the battery makers aren't going to want it, and like we think there's equilibrium, but we need to quote on projects, we need to have a stable source, and then if we do an offtake, then that's fundable on, let's say, your side or the producer's side, and then whatever, $15 or whatever it is, and then yes, everybody can sort of operate at that level. Do you think that it would be sort of it wouldn't go into the spot market, it'd be long-term offtakes?
No, exactly. Yeah. And which then, creates its own pressure when people can't get spot, because it's all being dedicated from new production to long-term off-takers. Well, that means that the market's going to be pretty dry for people who just require, sort of odd lots of a metal. But, not my problem, because we'd be hoping to tie up relationships with big end users so they can develop and we can develop along with them.
The antimony market is obviously quite a small market compared to a lot of the other markets, and there are not a lot of mines out there. But are there a lot of other sort of known deposits, or like, let's say when activity starts happening within the antimony market, are people going to say, oh, we know we got some good drill results down in wherever, yeah, or hey, there's an old mine down in the mountains up here that we can, yeah, sort of fire up as well? It'll take a few years, but is it a known, are there a bunch of known resources out there?
I know where I've been doing antimony for a long while, so I know where the old mines are that were shut down, because what happened essentially was in the early 80s, there was a varied, diversified antimony mining community around the world. The Chinese decided that they were going to run everybody else out of town, and they sunk the price down to a level that was unviable. And so virtually overnight, all the mines in Europe shut, the remnant mines in North America shut, and a few mines in Australia and other places shut. So they were all essentially run out of town. Those mines, though, were not exhausted. The interesting thing about antimony mines is that they can go on forever. The Consolidated Murchison mine in South Africa, which was once the world's largest, ran from the 1930s until 2015. The Costerfield mine that Mandalay owned in Australia has been going since the 1860s and is still going. The Chinese mine, Twinkling Star, was found in the 1500s and has been going since then. So antimony mines have a phenomenally long lifespan. The problem, though, is that antimony appears in veins. The veins can be a few inches wide, they can be a meter wide, or even wider, but they're not very amenable to drilling. And so even a company like Mandalay, with their Costerfield mine, could not produce a resource that's more than a few years out from its production. So people look at that and they say, not much resource, their mine's going to be done in a year and a half. well, 160 years later, the mine's still going. So what happens is you've really got to find the vein, follow the vein, got to do underground drilling. And you can only do underground drilling if you've got a mine. If you're drilling from the surface, it is somewhat the opposite of shooting fish in a barrel, because you're drilling blind into where you think there might be a vein. You miss it by 2 inches, you come up with absolutely nothing. And so the secret with antimony is really to go after brownfield sites, old mines, reactivate the old mines, dewater them, and then do underground drilling, and actually, trial mining, get them going again, because nothing succeeds like production.
All right, thank you. Should I move the slide forward here? Or?
Yeah, please do. Okay, so we've talked about the mass energy applications there. If you can go on.
And I just sort of editor's comment here. People talk about, and you did mention this, there are sort of with different horses for different tracks or whatever. There's not going to be one dominant battery version throughout the whole world. Some batteries formulations are good for cars, some are good for maybe heavy equipment, some are good for utility storage, some are good for power drills and so forth. So there's no winner and loser. There are going to be a lot of winners depending on the market and the segment. I just wanted to kind of
absolutely. Yeah, there's going to be no element or metal element from the periodic table that is going to dominate here and drive the others out, because different formats work in different ways. Lithium-ion batteries in a very cold environment, they may work well in a car, but if you were to put one outside in a very frigid location like Manitoba or Saskatchewan in the winter, the lithium-ion battery as a mass storage device would fail miserably, because it needs to be inside and it needs to be heated. Antimony molten salt batteries make their own heat. And so they're ideally suited for the more, colder climates that they might be located in. But the same thing, you can put them out in the desert and they don't spontaneously combust in the way that a lithium-ion battery would. So I think that the future will be that we will see virtually no applications of mass storage using lithium-ion, because lithium-ion will be too valuable to be wasted in that. It will be used in the EVs and the small applications like cell phones and laptops and things like that. It will not be used for mass storage because it's a waste of lithium's potential. Just as antimony will not be used, and molten salt batteries will not be used in cars because they get too hot. They get hot, but they don't get fire. But you're not going to be wanting to drive around with a vast mass of molten salt under the hood of your car.
And I also suspect that in terms of scaling ability, I don't know why I have that, but I presume they scale much bigger, like they're much more efficient and useful on a big scale than in a tiny one if you could fit it into your pocket.
No, absolutely. There are a few examples where you might have one of them, but there are many examples where if you've got to say a big solar array, and there is one out in the desert of Nevada, where they just have ranks and ranks of the solar panels, but they also have ranks and ranks of the batteries, which is storing the power that's coming off the solar panels.
All right.
Cool. Here's an interesting chart. This chart here shows that in terms of thermal storage, I only discovered this chart a week or two ago, and it was just sort of like eye-popping. Because the storage abilities of molten salt are just way, way, way higher than any of the other applications. You can see lithium-ion there, a fraction of the molten salt's abilities. But then you have a look at vanadium redox flow batteries, which are sometimes viewed as the competition molten salt batteries, and you can see that their storage attractiveness is like infinitesimal. It's not good at all. So molten salt, at least as a storage format, it just wins hands down.
What is the energy density you get out of molten salt batteries? Is that like per kilo or per cubic meter or that? How does that compare to EV or hydrogen or other forms of storage?
It's not really comparable because, you know, in the format of the product is being produced outside the electricity. It's being produced by the panels and wind turbines. The batteries are essentially pretty inert objects. They sit there, they take in the energy, they release the energy, and they're told what to do. Batteries are not living things in a sense. Just some of them are better at their lifestyles than others. And in the case of molten salt, as this chart quite clearly shows, the efficiency is way, way higher in the molten salt format. It's just someone stumbled upon this in the 1940s, and it's taken, what, 60 years, 70 years for someone to say, hey, let's take this technology and give it the practical applications it deserves. If we go to the next chart, I think the next
Christopher,
chart,
sorry, I'm just realizing I don't understand what this chart means. What, like, molten is 75% of what? Like, I don't, and chilled water thermal is 4% in terms of.
These are ways of storing energy, and it's the ability of those formats to actually store that energy and to hold that amount of energy, which is the most efficient. If you put in
a gigawatt of energy into a molten salt thermal storage system, you would be able to take 75% of that out and you'd lose 25% to waste, while a lithium ion battery is 59%. Is that how to read this?
No, this is all comparative between the different formats. It's not in absolute terms of, it's not like a recovery of the energy from it. It's the efficiency. You know, it's a mystery to an extent, because when you see these energy ratings on you know, household appliances, you think, how do they work that out? How do they know how many pieces of toast I make with this toaster, or how often I use this coffee machine? It's not really like that. It's just a measure of how efficient they are at holding the charge.
Okay. All right. There we go.
Okay, this is an interesting little chart, but I'll just show it briefly. This is from Ambry, and we can say Ambry is a bit biased in this respect. And of course, antimony prices and lithium prices have moved since this chart was done over a year ago. But you can see the price differential there between antimony and lithium, and both of the metals have gone up. So I think that we might see that the antimony price is maybe double that now, because that's what's happened to the antimony price. But, you know, maybe the price of lithium-ion batteries is 2/3 higher, because the price of lithium and cobalt and other things have gone up that go into that mix. But the margin is so large between lithium-ion and molten salt in terms of the cost of the inputs. By that I mean the metal inputs, not the efficiency of the batteries, the metal inputs. You can see there that that lithium antimony molten salt is way ahead of lithium ion, and they'd have to be getting down significantly the amount of lithium and cobalt and other factors that were included in a lithium ion battery to even compete with the molten salt format. But really, in my view, you know, these two are complementary technologies, not competing ones, because lithium-ion is for autos and small electronic formats, whereas antimony molten salt is mass storage. So, you know, it's an interesting chart. It shows one cheaper than the other, but, you know, they're not exactly apples and oranges.
Yeah, and I presume it'll happen as well with the molten salt, but like the cost of lithium batteries does decline every year as they get more efficient and find new formulations as well. There's an ongoing sort of knife fight among efficiency and cost.
Yep, no, absolutely. Okay, so this is the mine that we're pursuing. I've mentioned it before. It's in actually quite an interesting area of Nova Scotia. That's seeing a lot of activity these days for gold. And in fact, they did discover gold at West Gore. They were mining the mine from 1888 until 1908, when somebody bothered to assay, and they found quite high gold ratings within the ore, and because of what they've been doing was just loading all this antimony, masses of stibnite rock onto ships and sending off to the UK to get smelted. They weren't bothering to test for the gold content, and so they discovered, that there was also gold there. But really, when the mine shut down in 1917, the life that it had, people were only interested really at that stage, because gold was a lot cheaper then, and antimony was too, in the stibnite content of the mine, not in the gold component. But we're interested in the gold component as well. So if we go on a bit, we'll see, there's a bit of a history of the mine. There was an estimation was done in the late 40s about the size of the dumps and the tailings at the site, because when antimony mines, it's pretty easy to high grade them, where you see this like really juicy rocks with the antimony in it, to take that and send it off for roasting, and then anything that's less obvious, just chuck it on low grade stockpiles. And so these low grade stockpiles have just been sitting there really since before the First World War. And our intention is to actually rework these, because certainly at the current prices, it's a very attractive proposition. So we go to the next slide. We don't need to dwell too much on this, but as I mentioned, it's in an area that's seeing a lot of activity now. Nova Scotia's gone from being sort of like a forgotten province in the mining sphere for a few decades, but it's always been important as a location for barite mines and things, but it's had a lot of gold mining in the past, a lot of antimony mining, a lot of other minerals, and it was largely forgotten, but now it's very much back in favour. And then Nova Scotia is hot, dare I say it. Of course, Atlantic Gold developed their large mine there, and then that was taken over by Santa Barbara. It's really an exciting spot to be at the moment, because people are starting to realise that, the gold there is much more accessible, and there's a lot more of it than people thought in the past. So we can go on. These are our claims. We can go on from there. This is an example of the type of shaft. This shaft was actually done much after the main mine was closed. It was only around 60 feet deep, but it was just done by some small prospectors at the time, and it was shut down, in fact, on the eve of the Second World War, when the Canadian government dictated that miners had to go and be engaged in profitable activity and productive activities, like working in big zinc, copper, and iron ore mines for the war effort, not fooling around looking for gold. But there's some pretty stunning gold grades down there that you can see at the bottom of this sort of mini mine. And one of our goals is to actually get looking at this shaft complex again, to see what we can do to reach down to those levels and see what's there. If we could go on. Okay, we did some sample. I was the CEO of another mining company, and we actually staked West Gore back in a period when the antimony price was in the doghouse. The gold price, no one gave a damn. We did some sampling of the dumps, in fact. We didn't really realize that there were so many dumps around, and that that they'd actually been quantified before. So we did our own sampling at that time, and we came up with these pretty stunning results from just off the dumps. So we're pretty excited that with the potential there to get production going, to create a source of revenue that will fund our exploration at West Gore and in other locations. Next slide. Okay, our path to value is basically doing some exploration, doing some more exploration, working on the information that we've got. There's actually some drone aeromag going on at this very moment. We did some MMI sampling a few months ago, or last year. But our goal then is to move towards actually probably parallel with these. So it's really not a phase 3. It's more like a phase 1A is to be doing the reprocessing of the dumps after some initial sampling right from the get-go. So we don't want to drag our feet on getting into production, particularly with prices being as attractive as they are at the moment. We go to the next page. See that the process for reprocessing the dumps is actually quite straightforward. You can see that there was estimated back in 1949 that there was 1.2 million pounds of antimony still lying around in the dumps, which equates to around 630 short tons and 570 metric tons, which at today's prices is 6.8 million. So it's not to be sneezed at. And that the gold ounces, which don't really amount to much compared to some of the big mines these days, but still they are a nice icing on the cake, and they're just lying around in the dumps. And so even those at current prices would be worth around $4 million. So our goal is to see, particularly with the antimony, how much of that we can get out of the ground, because we can start then showing to off-takers that we can deliver. And our goal then, after we've essentially had all this set up, which has quite a small budget going, is to then start doing some underground trial mining and then sending that product as well into the processing circuit, which will have essentially have been paid for via the reprocessing efforts. So we go on a bit more. This is just a bit of a screenshot here of the assessment that was made based upon data from the Nova Scotia Department of Mines. People say, oh, historic resource, they didn't know what they were doing back then. I would not say so, because many antimony mines from the past produce a lot more than the ones that are producing today. So they did know what they were doing. And in this case, this data was collected by the Nova Scotia Department of Mines, sampling the dumps, and then a mining engineer actually turned into a form of resource, and that's where we got the numbers on the previous page. But of course, as I said, it's not NI 43-101 compliant, because it hasn't been done to the standards that are used these days. But back in those days, that's what he thought was there. If we can go on a bit. In fact, we won't talk too much about that, but that's capital structure at the moment. That's from the initial funding rounds of the private company. So, questions?
Sorry, I was muted there. So where is Battery Elements at right now in terms of its development, and what would be the time frame going forward? You're in full ownership of the old mine, and
yes, yeah, we've exercised the options on the mine, not only on the original mine, but we've also exercised the map that was in there for a surrounding collection of claims. So now all of the old mine, before we only had like 2/3 of it, now we've got it all under our control.
All right, and so what do you hope to accomplish, let's say, over the next 6 months or through the end of this year, and then
listing with funding, and then getting straight into that. What we're doing work already on the site, so it's not like we're waiting. Because many companies wait until they're listed to be doing the stuff. We've been doing it already. Then also we have several other past producing mines in our sites, not in Canada. The only one that we have is in Canada at the moment. One is in South America, and one is in Central Europe. Two are in Central Europe. But we know of many other past producing mines that we'd like to have. But really, we would see our ideal situation where we maybe have 4 small producing mines that add up to 6 to 7% of global production. We'd be very happy with that, because we feel that would be a profitable enterprise. And so that's our goal. But in the short term, we'd be looking over the winter to getting in place the permits to do the reprocessing. In the spring, we would basically hopefully got the permits, then go into production, because most of this equipment that is just off the shelf. We're not talking about building some mega structure there. We'd be looking to be processing several tens of tons a day of material with a very small workforce, and then sending that off to be toll roasted at one of the non-Chinese roasting operations.
So what is going to be the cost to set up the basic processing on the mine site, ballpark?
We've worked out what it is, and it's under $1 million. But as we don't have a PA, we can't really talk about that. We'll just have to leave it at that. But you know,
so it's not
too much on the processing would be unviable. We want to be making sure that of that type of in situ value, we're getting most of it, because we're not interested in splurging on enormous capex. We want to be able to get the processing going fast. And the bigger your structure is, the more tonnage you want to put through a short amount of time, the more cost you. Frankly, we're happy to process the dumps over a period of 18 months from when we start to when we've finished those. And hopefully by the stage that we're finished, we're also already including product from trial mining underground.
All right, so it's not a lot of capex to get your production
going. Not at all.
And the roasters, they sound like they're all overseas, or are there?
Yeah, there are no roasters left in Canada that do antimony. In fact, the largest roasters that are outside China are in Oman and in Mexico. So Mexico obviously is the closest.
Gotcha. And in terms of you've raised some money, do you have plans on going public? What would the general, or what can you talk about on that front, about how long that would take and the steps associated with that?
Our goal is to be listed before the end of this year.
All right. Okay.
Well advanced. Let's put it that way.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great, Christopher. I'm not seeing any further questions out of the audience, and I'm run out of questions myself, and we're about an hour into this. So that was very thorough. And
thank you
for making the time to explain the interesting market of antimony and your strategy going forward. So any final words? No,
that's it. I probably said too much. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Christopher. That was great. And maybe we'll get you back here and you can give us an update after you go public.
I'd love to. Yeah, that would be good. Show what progress we've made. Excellent.
That's awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks.